Okay, so let's talk now about the essays. We're still with the June 2015 exam. We start with the thematic essay questions, part 2. And they remind you to describe something means to illustrate something in words or tell about it. To discuss means to make observations about something using facts, reasoning, and argument. So describe means to talk about it and define it. To discuss means to analyze it. Alright, so here we go. Thematic essay question. Theme, organizations. Throughout United States history, individuals and groups have formed organizations to achieve specific reforms. The reform efforts of these organizations have met with varying degrees of success. Task, identify 2 organizations that were formed to achieve a specific reform, and for each, describe the historical circumstances surrounding the formation of the organization. Describe, that is, tell what they were, and then discuss the degree to which the organization's reform efforts were successful. So discuss means analyze. Describe means tell me about how the organization was founded, why, what was going on at the time. Discuss means analyze how successful it was. Okay. So here's what you have to do before we get to the organizations. You have to remember that when you write this essay, it should have the following form. 4 paragraphs, at least. Paragraph 1, your introduction, should have your thesis. We have talked about the thesis to death. Don't just restate the question they give you. Add to it. So you can't, your introduction can't be this. You can't just say, here's my essay. Throughout the United States history, individuals and groups have formed organizations to achieve specific reforms. The reform efforts of these have met with varying degrees of success. You can't just restate that. You have to give your own thought on this. So if you're going to pick a couple of organizations, you can say instead, throughout U.S. history, individuals and groups have formed organizations to achieve specific reforms. Some of these reforms have been about changing the very nature of American society and our social relationships between different groups and different classes. You go on and say the reform efforts of these organizations have met with varying degrees of success. In some cases, they succeeded totally. In other cases, they failed. You have to give something more than just recopying what's in that box. Okay? Your essay is then going to look at 2 organizations. So in this case, paragraph 2 would be your first organization. Paragraph 3 would be your second organization. And this is just a general outline I made here. So for each organization, paragraph 1, your first organization, you're going to take time to describe the circumstances and then analyze whether or not it was successful. Paragraph 2, describe the organization, why it was set up, how it was set up, and the degree to which it was successful. And then finally, you're going to have a 4th paragraph, which is your conclusion, in which you summarize what you said. And then you wrap it up together in a nice, neat package. We've talked about how to write an essay. Okay, so in this thematic essay, what kind of organizations can you use? Now, you can use any organization from your study of U.S. history. I would suggest, if possible, you use one of the ones they list. Now, of course, you're not going to see this particular essay, but you'll see something like it. try to use something they list because you know that that's a safe choice, unless you are sure that something not listed there absolutely fits and you know a lot about it. Okay, so some suggestions you might consider. Let's talk about these. You might consider the American Anti-Slavery Society, 1833. So, historical circumstances. American Anti-Slavery Society was created before the Civil War, obviously, by both northern white abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery and ex-slaves. One of the famous members of the American Anti-Slavery Society was Frederick Douglass, a guy who had been a slave, escaped as a slave, came north, and became one of the great intellectual leaders of the abolitionist movement. Another early leader of this organization was William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was a newspaper editor. We remember we talked about him. Super strong abolitionist. White guy. Also, though, were people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Northern women who were motivated by religious causes to get involved in the anti-slavery movement. That should be interesting to us because Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would use their experience in the Anti-Slavery Society eventually to go on to form the National Women Suffrage Association. And they would be prominent leaders in the movement to get women the vote and their rights. That kind of grows out of the Anti-Slavery Society. What degree the organization's reform were successful? Well, the Anti-Slavery Society doesn't really become successful until the Civil War itself. It's really with the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery that they get what they have been pushing for all along, and which of course transforms society by completely eliminating this institution called slavery. The National Women Suffrage Association, founded by many women who had been involved in the anti-slavery cause, as we just said. They get their success slowly. As we talked about, a lot of those Western states, the newly emerging Western states in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Wyoming and places like that, are the first ones, state by state by state, to give women the vote. And it's finally in 1919, after women have been so important in the U.S. getting through the First World War, that President Woodrow Wilson backs the constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment in 1919, that gives women their vote. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, 1874, also comes in part out of that anti-slavery and women's suffrage. Temperance, which is really prohibition, comes out of women's experience of so many guys being alcoholics and beating the kids and losing their jobs, and so women see it as we would consider the drug problem of their age, so they want to prohibit alcohol. They too have a slow march of success of a kind. 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, state by state by state, they get states to prohibit alcohol. Remember I mentioned that's how Coca-Cola comes about in Georgia in the 1870s. Finally, the same time women get the vote in 1919 and 1920, so we get the Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment, which prohibits alcohol. So in that sense, they win. But in another sense, and this would be great to mention in an essay, because you get to say, on the one hand they win, on the other hand they lose, because prohibition turns out not to solve the problem. It doesn't make alcoholism go away. It doesn't make all the social problems that go with alcohol go away. So they get what they've been looking for, but they don't get what they were looking for. The American Federation of Labor, 1886. What's the historical circumstances there? We have the industrialization of the United States. Workers are beginning to form unions. Early attempt at a union was the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor wanted one big union for all workers of all kinds, and they wanted to transform American society. Well, the Knights of Labor falls apart. Their ideas are too broad, too radical, and they frighten Americans with how much they want to change society. The Haymarket riot, which really the Knights of Labor had nothing to do with, gets blamed on them. But instead, the American Federation of Labor gets founded. Samuel Gompers. And what makes the AFL different is that they don't try to transform American society. They focus very narrowly, first of all, not on all workers of all kinds, but only on skilled workers. And second, not on transforming society, but on workplace issues. Better wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. Keep it narrow to what that worker wants in his workplace. Does the AFL succeed? Yes, very much so. The AFL still exists today as a union that takes in an awful lot of unions under it, and they help to reform the workplace over time with union contracts. The Populist Party, 1890. What was the Populist Party about? Populist Party was that farmers' political party that was trying to get a better deal for farmers. In some ways they succeed, and in some ways they don't. They would like to have increased inflation. They wanted free coinage of silver, remember, which would have increased the money supply, driven prices up, which farmers like. It's good for farmers. They never get that, really. What do they get? They get the Interstate Commerce Commission, which helps to reform railroads and railroad pricing to protect farmers. The Anti-Defamation League, we really didn't touch on much in class. The Anti-Defamation League is an organization that was founded to protect particularly Jewish people, Jewish immigrants, from anti-Semitism. Again, we didn't really talk about it much, so you can stay away from that one, but just so you know, the Jewish people have always been the subjects of hatred, not just in Nazi Germany. And the Anti-Defamation League was when you had large Jewish immigration coming into the United States, founded to be the kind of debating side of this, to appeal to people's reasons, to give them better education and information so they wouldn't fear some sort of Jewish conspiracy. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, exists even down to our own day today, and they combat not just anti-Semitism, but all sorts of prejudice and racism. United Farm Workers, we also didn't get to talk about much. That was founded by a guy named Cesar Chavez, C-H-A-V-E-Z, and was an attempt to unionize migrant workers. Throughout the agricultural industry, you have all of these laborers, unskilled jobs, people who just go out in the fields to pick the fruit or pick the vegetables. They don't have long-term employment. If you're a farmer, you only need these people a few weeks a year. You go out there and you plant your grapes or your lettuce or whatever. You let it grow, and then for a few weeks you need an awful lot of workers to go out there and harvest it, and then you don't need them anymore. So these migrant workers would go from farm to farm, from region to region, depending on what the season was. So as soon as you were done harvesting whatever strawberries, then the grapes were coming into season, and as soon as the grapes were out of season, it was apple harvesting time. And so you move from place to place to do this. But these people had absolutely no protection. They didn't have long-term employment. They didn't have a regular relationship with an employer, and because they were therefore easy to exploit. Cesar Chavez organized them into the United Farm Workers to create a kind of union to speak on their behalf. And it has had mixed success. The situation of farm workers today is much better than it was. There are laws in place requiring employers to treat them fairly. There are some protections available to them. However, on the other hand, a great number of them are, of course, illegal aliens, and therefore they don't have a lot of protection anyway, because all the employer has to do is call immigration on them, and they know that, so they're easy to exploit. National Organization for Women, now founded in 1966. By that time, women had the vote. Of course, they got the vote in, we said, 1919. So the 1960s and 70s, you have a new women's movement. And what did the new women's movement want? Well, they wanted, if you will, not just legal equality, but real equality. It's one thing to say that women could vote. It's another thing to guarantee that they had to get paid the same amount of money for doing the same work as a man. It was quite common in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s that if you had two people in front of you, a guy and a girl, and you were hiring them for your business, you'd offer the guy more money than the girl. A lot of that was because there were these sort of assumptions built in. That if you were a girl, this was a second income. Really, you were dependent on your husband. And so you didn't really need as much money because this was only a second income for you. That you were only in a job temporarily until you waited around till you got married, and then you were going to go off and have kids. Well, women in the 60s and 70s began to say, wait a minute, if we're doing the same work as a man, we should get paid the same amount. And some of us want to have a career as a professional, and we should be treated equally. National Organization for Women proposed an amendment to the Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have prohibited discrimination of any kind based on sex. The Equal Rights Amendment, however, never actually gets passed, so it doesn't become part of the Constitution. So the National Organization for Women, in one sense, failed. In another sense, it succeeded. They didn't get that constitutional amendment, but they created that equal pay for equal work thing as an issue that politicians now have to take very seriously. And we don't have a constitutional amendment, but we have all kinds of other laws that protect people against discrimination in the workplace and discrimination in hiring and discrimination in pay. One that should be of interest to you guys is an educational act called Title IX. I mentioned this in class several times. Title IX of the Federal Educational Act says that when a college or university spends money on guys, they have to spend just as much on the ladies. Okay, but what does that mean in practice? It means if you have a football team, which is a gigantically expensive thing for a university to run, if you give football scholarships to guys, for every dime you spend on a football team, for every dime that you give in a football scholarship, you must spend money on women's sports and scholarships for women. That's why at these big universities that have these, massive football programs, you also have pretty massive women's tennis, swimming, gymnastics, volleyball programs, because you have to add it up and make sure that you are spending as much on women's sports overall as you are on men's sports. Okay, let's take a look at the DBQ, Document-Based Question. So they give you you guys remember this, they give you the question up front, then they give you the documents, then they give you the question again. Historical context. Throughout the United States history, presidents have taken actions that have had a significant impact on the United States. 3 such actions were Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy, Teddy Roosevelt's support for consumer protection, and Lyndon Johnson's support for civil rights. Okay. Task. Using the information from the documents and your knowledge of American history, answer the questions that follow each of the documents, and then choose 2 presidential actions, and for each describe the historical circumstances around that presidential action, and then discuss the impact it had on the U.S. and American society. Okay, so you're going to talk about each of the documents, of course, and then you're going to pick 2 of these things. Andrew Jackson and the Indians, where am I? Whoop. Teddy Roosevelt and consumer protection, or Lyndon Johnson and civil rights, and talk about them. Let's look at the documents. Document 1. Okay. So, source James Wilson, The Earth Shall Weep, A History of Native America, 1998. What does this tell you down here, by the way? This tells you this is not a primary source. This is not written by an Indian or written by Andrew Jackson or something. This is an historian writing later, analyzing. Okay. The southeastern Indians were particularly vulnerable. The traffic in deerskins, in which they had been intimately involved, had increasingly been replaced by a thriving cotton trade, spurred on by the invention of the cotton gin. So the cotton gin makes their traffic in deerskins less useful, because people are wearing cotton clothes now, in which they were at best marginal producers and at worst obstacles to laying hungry whites. So the Indians were starting to get in the way of the cotton trade. Aha, interesting. Much of their remaining territory was rich farmland, and the more they improved it, in the hope of turning themselves into acceptable neighbors, the more desirable it became to plantation owners. Popular song at the time went, "All I ask in this creation is a pretty little life in a big plantation way up yonder in the Cherokee Nation." Okay, so what does this document say? The Cherokee Indians, the southeastern Indians, used to live on trading deerskins to whites. Whites don't want deerskins anymore because they're growing too much cotton. The Indians try to make their land better and try to become cotton farmers themselves. And the whites say, "Ooh, now you've got a nice cotton farm, Indians. Now we want your cotton farm." So according to James Wilson, what's one reason Native American Southwest were removed from their lands? Because white plantation owners wanted these improved farms to expand their own cotton plantations. Now, that would be one good answer for that one. Okay. President Andrew Jackson had signed the Indian Removal Act on May 28, 1830. Okay. Source, President Andrew Jackson, Second Annual Message to Congress, 1830. So he's giving a speech to Congress about this. All right, I won't read it to you. You can stop the tape or stop the video now if you want to read it. Okay, so according to President Andrew Jackson, what are two reasons for establishing an Indian removal policy? Now, here's what I'm going to warn you. When they say that, two reasons, don't make sure you are not saying the same thing twice. If it says two reasons, they have to be two different reasons. So you can't just say, it will open the territory between Tennessee on the north and Louisiana south. It will open the territory to settlement of whites. That's the same reason. So you've got to give two different ones. So opening that territory to the settlement of whites, relieve the state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy, and enable those states to rapidly advance in power, separate the Indians from contact with settlements of whites, free the Indians from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way. Those are all different reasons. All right. Indian removal, 1830 to 1854. By the way, do we remember the court case that this is based on? Worcester v. Georgia. Worcester were the Indians that sued Georgia and said, you can't remove us. We have a treaty with the federal government. And the Supreme Court said, the Indians are right, Georgia, you can't remove them. And Andrew Jackson said, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, I'm going to help Georgia remove them. Okay, Indian cession, C-E-S-S, that means territory that you give away, to cede territories to give it away. So there you have, this is all area that the Indians gave up, and the Indian territory you should recognize is roughly Oklahoma and a little bit more there. Migration from here out there, we call that the Trail of Tears, and you see that therefore out in Indiana you had Indians from Florida, from Georgia, from Mississippi, from Indiana, from Michigan, that all wound up out there. Okay. What's the question? That's 3A, 3B. Chester Alan Arthur, message to Congress. And assuming you've now read this, based on these documents, what are two effects of the federal removal policy of American Indians? Well, you might say from the map, one effect is that Indians were moved to what's clearly different and unfamiliar territory to them. People whose homes were in Georgia are now suddenly out in the plains of the West, for instance. And according to Chester Alan Arthur, another effect is collisions with the white settlers. You can find other ones in there. Okay, now we get to, so that's the Indians. Now we get to Teddy Roosevelt and his consumer protection stuff. In 1906, President Roosevelt appointed a commission to investigate practices in meat packing plants. That's a result of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And you see, again, I'm assuming that you've stopped the video and read this by now. And you can see what he found basically in these meatpacking plants were disgusting. Here you have political cartoon. There's Teddy Roosevelt, his investigation that's raking through this garbage, a nauseating job, makes you want to throw up, stinking job, but it has to be done. Okay, based on these documents, what is one reason that President Roosevelt supported consumer protection laws? Well, because he discovered that the meat industry was selling unhealthy meat to consumers. Simple enough. Advertisement. Postum Cereal Company. And I'll just show you this. Postum, CW Post. Yes, there is a university named for CW Post, and that's the Post Food Company. So a lot of your breakfast cereals, even today, if you go down the breakfast cereal aisle in the supermarket, a lot of them are still produced by the Post Company. Okay, Postum Cereal Company. We warrant and guarantee that all packages of Postum cereal, grape nuts, and Elijah's Manna, which was that was the name of one of their breakfast cereals, hereafter sold by any job or retailer, comply with the provisions of the National Pure Food Law, and are not and shall not be adulterated or misbranded. What are they talking about? That Pure Food and Drug Act. So the Postum Cereal Company is very proud of the fact that their food is certified as healthy. Our foods are pure, and they have not been and always will. They are not misbranded. Misbranded means, well, it says here, printed a truthful statement on the package of the ingredients contained. So you have to be honest about the ingredients in your food. What is one way the Pure Food and Drug Act would protect consumers? It required that food labeling be accurate as to what's actually in the food, which seems very obvious to us, but at the time it was a new idea. Okay, this is a This is Lyndon Johnson, statement upon signing the Wholesome Poultry Act in 1968. So Teddy Roosevelt, 1902-34, signed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, and in 1968, Lyndon Johnson signed an expansion of that. 8 months ago, I signed the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967. Landmark bill capped a crusade that had begun 60 years ago to assure housewives the meat they served their families was pure, not harmful, dirty, or diseased. Proud to sign a bill to extend the same coverage to poultry products, that's chicken and so on. Okay. Base document, how did Roosevelt continue the consumer protection action begun by President Roosevelt? Very simple. He extended the Pure Meat, the Meat Inspection Act to include also poultry, chicken, turkey, like that. Okay. This is John F. Kennedy. Now we've moved from Teddy Roosevelt and his consumer protection to civil rights. So this is John F. Kennedy, radio address on civil rights in 1963. And you can stop and read that for a minute. Okay. According to Kennedy, what is one inequality African Americans continue to face in '63? Well, he can't eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, can't send his kids to the best public schools, can't vote for public officials. Right there, there's three. Here we have picture Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson addresses the nation. So he's sitting at the desk, he's about to sign the Civil Rights Act into law, and he gave a radio talk. Again, I will assume that you stop and read this. Okay, what is one reason Johnson supported the Civil Rights Act? Americans of every race and color have died in battle to protect our freedom. How about that? If they can give their lives to protect America, then they deserve equal treatment. Okay? Here we got another piece here. Robert Levy, Brief History of the Civil Rights Act, 1985. So this is a historian again. I'm assuming you've read this. Two effects of the Civil Rights Act. The act ended virtually immediately and completely all forms of segregation in North and South. The act empowered the Attorney General of the United States to sue for desegregation. Those I would consider that two separate things. It ended desegregation and gave the Attorney General the right to enforce that. But you could also say it gave equal employment opportunity and affirmative action in hiring, fixed in American life. Voting Rights Act, 65. Again, I imagine you're going to stop and read. One effect of the Voting Rights Act. Well, one effect was blacks were voting in large numbers in the South. Blacks held political office. So, there are two. Okay, and then you get back to this. So you got to use at least 4 documents. Try to use more than that. And from this, historical circumstances surrounding the President's action and the impact. And from the documents, you should be able to put that together. Just remember that you do 2 presidential, for this one, you do 2 presidential actions, and both the circumstances surrounding it, and explain the impact. Don't just state it, give it some meat. Make sure you fully answered the question. Okay, that's it for the June 2015 Regents.